Welcome to Fiber Pages. This is Jill. My channel is FiberFloozieCrafts, and this is where I read to you while I work on a project. Our book is Alice Adams by Booth Tarkington. I'm working on a Floozie sweater. This is a design that I have been working on for a long time. I have adapted from another pattern to work for my needs. Made it easier for me to do and for me to teach to other people how to make a sweater. Chapter 1. The patient, an old-fashioned man, thought the nurse made a mistake in keeping both of the windows open, and her sprightly disregard of his protests added something to his hatred of her. Every single evening, he told her, anybody with ordinary gumption ought to realize that night air was bad for human frame. The human frame won't stand everything, Miss Perry, he warned her, resentfully. Even a child, if it had just ordinary gumption, ought to know enough not to let the night air blow on sick people. Yes, nor well people either. Keep out of the night air, no matter how well you feel. That's what my mother used to tell me when I was a boy. Keep out of the night air, Virgil, she'd say. I expect probably her mother told her the same thing, the nurse suggested. Of course she did. My grandmother. Oh, I guess your grandmother thought so, Mr. Adams. That was when all this flat central country was swampish and hadn't been drained off yet. I guess the truth must been the swamp mosquitoes bit people and gave 'em malaria, especially before they began to put screens in their windows. Well, we got screens in these windows, and no mosquitoes are going to bite us. So you just be a good boy and rest your mind and go to sleep like you need to. Sleep, he said. Likely. He thought the night air worst of all in April. He hadn't a doubt it would kill him. He declared, it's miraculous what the human frame will survive. He admitted on the last evening of that month, but you and the doctor ought to both be taught it won't stand too dang much. You poison a man and poison him with this April night air. Can't poison you with that much of it, more of it, Miss Perry interrupted him indulgently. Tomorrow it'll be May night air, and I expect that'll be a lot better for you. Don't you? Now, let's sober down and be a good boy and get some nice sound sleep. She gave him his medicine, and having set the glass upon the center table, returned to her cot, where after a still interval she snored faintly. Upon this, his expression became that of a man goaded out of overpowering weariness into irony. Sleep, certainly, thank you. However, he did sleep intermittently, drowsed between times, even dreamed, but forgetting his dreams before he opened his eyes, and having some part of him all the while aware of his discomfort. He believed as usual that he lay awake the whole night long. He was conscious of the city as of some single great creature resting fitfully in the dark outside his windows. It lay all about in a damp cover of its night cloud of smoke and tried to keep quiet for a few hours after midnight, but was too powerful a growing thing ever to lie altogether still. Even while it strove to sleep, it muttered with digestions of the day before, and those already merged with rumblings of the morrow. Owl cars bringing in last passengers over distant trolley lines now and then howled on a curve. Faraway metal stirrings could be heard from the store factories in the sooty suburbs on the plain outside the city. East, west, and south switch engines chugged and snorted on sidings, and everywhere in the air there seemed to be a faint, voluminous hum, as of innumerable wires trembling overhead to vibration of machinery underground. In his youth, Adams might have been less resentful of sounds such as these when they interfered with his night's sleep. Even during an illness, he might have taken some pride in them as proof of his citizenship in a live town. But at 55, he merely hated them because they kept him awake. They pressed on his nerves, as he put it, and so did almost everything else for that matter. He heard the milk wagon drive into the cross street beneath his windows and stop at each house. The milkman carried his jars around to the back porch while the horse moved slowly ahead to the gate of the next customers and waited there. He's gone into Pollock's, Adams thought, following this progress. I hope it'll sour 'em before breakfast. Delivered the Andersons. Now he's getting out ours. Listen to the darn brute. What's he care who wants sleep? His complaint was of the horse who casually shifted weight with the clink of steel shoes on the worn brick pavement of the street, and then heartily shook himself in his harness, perhaps to dislodge a fly far ahead of its season. Light had just filmed the windows, and with that the first sparrow woke, chirped instantly, and roused neighbors in the trees of the small yard, including a loud-voiced robin. Vociferations began irregularly, but were soon unanimous. Sleep? Dang likely now, ain't it? Night sounds were becoming day sounds. The faraway hooting of freight engines seemed brisker than an hour ago in the dark. A cheerful whistler passed the house, even more careless of sleepers than the milkman's horse had been. Then a group of colored workmen came by, and although it was impossible to be sure whether they were homeward bound from night work or on their way to day work, at least it was certain that they were jocose. Loose aboriginal laughter preceded them afar and beat on the air long after they gone by. The sick room nightlight, shielded from his eyes by a newspaper, propped against a water pitcher, still showed a thin glimmering that had grown offensive to Adams. In his wandering and enfeebled thoughts, which were much more often imaginings than reasonings, the attempt of the nightlight to resist the dawn reminded him of something unpleasant, though he could not discover just what the unpleasant thing was. Here was a puzzle that irritated him, the more because he could not solve it, yet always seemed just on the point of a solution. However, he may have lost nothing cheerful by remaining in the dark upon the matter, for if he had been a little sharper in this introspection, he might have concluded that the squalor of the nightlight, in its seeming effort to show against the forerunning of the sun itself, had stimulated some half-buried perception within him to sketch the painful little synopsis of an autobiography. In spite of noises without, he drowsed again, not knowing that he did, and when he opened his eyes, the nurse was just rising from her cot. He took no pleasure in the sight. It might be said, she exhibited to him a face mismodeled by sleep and set like a clay face left on its cheek in a hot and dry studio. She was still only in part awake, however, and by the time she had extinguished the nightlight and given her patient his tonic, she had recovered enough placidity. "Well, isn't that grand? We've had another good night," she said, as she departed to dress in the bathroom. "Yes, you had another," he retorted, though not until after she had closed the door. Presently, he heard his daughter moving about in her room, across the narrow hall, and so knew that she had risen. He hoped she would come in to see him soon, for she was the only thing that didn't press on his nerves. He felt, though the thought of her hurt him, as indeed every thought hurt him, but it was his wife who came first. She wore a lank cotton wrapper, and a crescent of gray hair escaped to one temple from beneath the handkerchief she had worn upon her head for the night, and still retained, but she did everything possible to make her expression cheering. "Oh, you're better again. I can see that as soon as I look at you," she said. "Miss Perry tells me you've had another splendid night." He made a sound of irony, which seemed to dispose unfavorably with Miss Perry, and then, in order to be more certainly intelligible, he added, "She slept well as usual." But his wife's smile persisted. "It's a good sign to be cross. It means you're practically convalescing right now." "Oh, I am I? No doubt in the world," she exclaimed. "Why, you're practically a well man, Virgil. All except getting your strength back, of course. And that isn't going to take long. You'll be right on your feet in a couple of weeks from now." "Oh, I will? Of course you will," she laughed briskly, and going to the table in the center of the room, moved his glass of medicine an inch or two, turned a book over so that it lay upon its other side, and for a few moments occupied herself with some similar futilities, having taken on the air of a person who makes things neat, though she produced no such actual effect upon them. "Of course you will," she repeated absently. "You'll be as strong as you ever were, maybe even stronger." She paused for a moment, not looking at him, then added cheerfully, "so that you can fly around and find something really good to get into." Something important between them came near the surface here. For though she spoke with what seemed but a casual cheerfulness, there was little betraying break in her voice. Trembling, just perceptive in the utterance of the final word, and she still kept up the affection of being helpfully preoccupied with the table, and did not look at her husband, perhaps because they had been married for so many years that without looking she knew just what his expression would be, and preferred to avoid the actual sight of it as long as possible. Meanwhile, he stared hard at her, his lips beginning to move with little distortions, not lacking in the pathos of a sick man's agitation. "So that's it," he said. "That's what you're hinting at." "Hinting?" Mrs. Adams looked surprised and indulgent. "Why, I'm not doing any hinting, Virgil." "What did you say about my finding something good to get into?" he asked sharply. "Don't you call that hinting?" Mrs. Adams turned toward him now. She came to the bedside and would have taken his hand, but he quickly moved it away from her. "You mustn't let yourself get nervous," she said. "But of course when you get well, there's only one thing to do. You mustn't go back to that old hole again." "Old hole? That's what you call it, is it?" In spite of his weakness, anger made his voice strident, and upon this stimulation she spoke more urgently. "You just mustn't go back to it, Virgil. It's not fair to any of us, and you know it isn't." "Don't tell me what I know, please." She clasped her hands, suddenly carrying her urgency to plaintive entreaty. "Virgil, you won't go back to that hole." That's a nice word to use to me, he said. Call a man's business a hole. Virgil, if you don't owe it to me to look for something different, don't you owe it to your children? Don't tell me you won't do what we all want you to, and what you know in your heart you ought to. And if you have got into one of those stubborn fits and are bound to go back there for no other reason except to have your own way, don't tell me so, for I can't bear it. He looked up at her fiercely. You've got a fine way to cure a sick man, he said. But she had concluded her appeal for that time, and instead of making any more words in the matter, let him see that there were tears in her eyes, shook her head, and left the room. Alone, he lay breathing rapidly, his emaciated chest proving itself equal to the demands, his emotion put upon it. Fine, he repeated with husky indignation. Fine way to cure a sick man. Fine. Then after a silence, he gave forth a whispering sound of laughter, his expression the whole while remaining sore and far from humor. And give us our daily bread, he added, meaning that his wife's little performance was no novelty. Chapter 2. In fact, the agitation of Mrs. Adams was genuine, but so well under her control that its traces vanished during the 3 short steps she took to cross the narrow hallway between her husband's door and the one opposite. Her expression was matter-of-fact, of course, rather than pathetic, as she entered the pretty room where her daughter, half-dressed, sat before a dressing-table and played with the reflections of a 3-leafed mirror framed in blue enamel. That is, just before the moment of her mother's entrance, Alice had been playing with the mirror's reflections, posturing her arms and her expressions, clasping her hands behind her back, and tilting back her head to foreshorten the face in a tableau conceived to represent sauciness, then one of a smiling weariness, then one of scornful toleration, and all very piquant. But as the door opened, she hurriedly resumed the practical and occupied her hands in the arrangement of her plentiful brownish hair. They were pretty hands, of a shapeliness delicate and fine. The best thing she's got, a cold-blooded girlfriend said of them, and meant to include Alice's mind and character in the implied list of possessions she surpassed by the notable hands. However that may have been, the rest of her was well enough. She was often called a right pretty girl, temperate praise meaning a girl rather pretty than otherwise, and this she deserved, to say the least. Even in repose she deserved it, although repose was anything but her habit, being seldom seen upon her except at home. On exhibition she led a life of gestures, the unkind said to make her lovely hands more memorable, but all of her usually accompanied the gestures of the hands, the shoulders ever giving them their impulse first, and even her feet being called upon at the same time for eloquence. To that of the face where her so much liveliness took proper place as only accessory to that of the face, where her vivacity reached its climax, and it was unfortunate that an ungifted young man new in town should have attempted to define the effect upon him of all this generosity of emphasis. He said that the way she used her cute hazel eyes and the wonderful glow of her facial expression gave her a mighty spiritual quality. His actual rendition of the word was spiritual, but it was not his pronunciation that embalmed this outburst in the perennial laughter of Alice's girlfriends. They made the misfortune far less than his. Far less his than hers. Her mother comforted her too heartily, insisting that Alice had plenty enough spiritual qualities, certainly more than possessed by the other girls who flung phrase at her, wooden things, jealous of everything they were incapable of themselves, and then Alice, getting more championship than she sought, grew uneasy lest Mrs. Adams should repeat such defenses outside the family, and Mrs. Adams ended by weeping because the daughter so distrusted her intelligence. Alice frequently thought it necessary to instruct her mother. Her morning greeting was an instruction today, or rather, it was an admonition in the style of an entreaty. The more petulant Alice thought that Mrs. Adams might have had a glimpse of the posturings to the mirror. This was a needless worry. The mother had caught 1,000 such glimpses, with Alice unaware, and she thought nothing of the one just flitted. For heaven's sake, Mamma, come clear inside the room and shut the door. Please don't leave it open for everybody to look at me. There isn't anybody to see you, Mrs. Adams explained, obeying. Miss Perry's gone downstairs, and Mamma, I heard you in Papa's room, Alice said, not dropping the note of complaint. I could hear both of you, and I don't think you ought to get poor old Papa too upset. Not in his present condition, anyhow. Mrs. Adams seated herself on the edge of the bed. He's better all the time, she said, not disturbed. He's almost well. The doctor says so, and Miss Perry says so. And if we don't get him into the right frame of mind now, we never will. The first day he's outdoors, he'll go back to that old hole. You'll see. And if he once does that, he'll settle down there, and it'll be too late, and we'll never get him out. Well, anyhow, I think you could use a little more tact with him. I do try to, the mother sighed. It never was much use with him. I don't think you understand him as well as I do, Alice. There's one thing I don't understand about either of you, Alice returned crisply. Before you people get married, before people get married, they can do anything they want to with each other. Why can't they do the same thing after they're married? When you and Papa were young and engaged, he'd have done anything you wanted him to. That must have been because you knew how to manage him then. Why can't you go at him the same way now? Mrs. Adams sighed again and laughed a little, making no other response, but Alice persisted. Well, why can't you? Why can't you ask him to do things the way you used to ask him when you were just in love with each other? Why don't you anyhow try it, Mamma, instead of ding-donging him? Ding-donging at him, Alice? Mrs. Adams said with a pathos somewhat emphasized. Is that how my trying to do what I can for you strikes you? Never mind that. It's nothing to hurt your feelings. Alice disposed of the pathos briskly. Why don't you answer my question? What's the matter with using a little more tact on Papa? Why can't you treat him the way you probably did when you were young people, before you were married? I never have understood why people can't do that. Perhaps one day you will understand. Someday, her mother said gently. Maybe you will when you've been married 25 years. You keep evading. Why don't you answer my question right straight out? There are questions you can't answer to young people, Alice. You mean because we're too young to understand the answer? I don't see that at all. At 22, a girl's supposed to have some intelligence, isn't she? And intelligence is the ability to understand, isn't it? Why do I have to wait till I've lived with a man 25 years to understand why you can't be tactful with Papa? You may understand some things before that, Mrs. Adams said tremulously. You may understand how you hurt me sometimes. Youth can't know everything by being intelligent. And by the time you could understand the answer, you're asking, you may understand some things before that, Mrs. Adams said tremulously. You may understand how you hurt me sometimes. Youth can't know everything by being intelligent, and by the time you could understand the answer you're asking for, you'd know it and wouldn't need to ask. You don't understand your father, Alice. You don't know what it takes to change him when he's made up his mind to be stubborn. Alice rose and began to get herself into a skirt. Well, I don't think making scenes ever changes anybody, she grumbled. I think a little jolly persuasion goes twice as far myself. A little jolly persuasion. Her mother turned the echo of this phrase into an ironic lament. Yes, there was a time when I thought that too. It didn't work, that's all. Perhaps you left the jolly part out of it, Mamma. For the second time that morning, it was now a little after 7 o'clock. Tears seemed to be about to offer their solace to Mrs. Adams. I might have expected you to say that, Alice. You never do miss a chance, she said gently. It seems queer you don't sometime miss just one chance. But Alice, progressing with her toilet, appeared to be little concerned. Oh, well, I think there are better ways of managing a man than just hammering at him. Mrs. Adams uttered a little cry of pain. Hammering, Alice? If you'd left it entirely to me, her daughter went on briskly, I believe Papa'd already be willing to do anything we want him to. That's it. Tell me I spoil everything. Well, I won't interfere from now on. You can be sure of it. Please don't talk like that, Alice said quickly. I'm old enough to realize that Papa may need pressure of all sorts. I only think it makes him more obstinate to get him cross. You probably do understand him better, but that's one thing I found out, and you haven't. There. She gave her mother a friendly tap on the shoulder and went into the door. I'll hop in and I'll say hello to him now. As she went, she continued the fastening of her blouse and appeared in her father's room with one hand still thus engaged, but she patted his forehead with the other. Poor old Papa Daddy, she said gaily. Every time he's better, somebody talks him into getting so mad he has a relapse. It's a shame. Her father's eyes beneath her melancholy brows looked up at her wistfully. I suppose you heard your mother going for me? He said. I heard you going for her, too, Alice laughed. And what was it all about? Oh, the same danged old story. You mean she wants you to try something new when you get well? Alice asked with cheerful innocence. So we could all have a lot more money? At this, his sorrowful forehead was more sorrowful than ever. The deep horizontal lines moved upward to a pattern of suffering so familiar to his daughter that it meant nothing to her. But he spoke quietly. Yes, so we wouldn't have any money at all, most likely. Oh, no, she laughed, and finishing with her blouse, patted his cheeks with both hands. Just think how many grand openings there must be for a man that knows as much as you do. I always did believe you could get rich if you only cared to, Papa. But upon his forehead the painful patterns still deepened. Don't you think we've always had enough? The way things are, Alice? Not the way things are. She patted his cheeks again. Laughed again. It used to be enough. Maybe, anyway, we did skimp it along. I'm going to bind off a couple of stitches here. Hang on. It's hard to count, read, and knit. And listen to Serbs over there doing all of his shenanigans. Uh-huh. You, bud. Not the way things are. She patted his cheeks again and laughed again. It used to be enough. Maybe anyway we did skimp along. But the way things are now, I expect Mom was really pretty practical in her ideas, though. I think it's a shame for her. You bother about it while you are so weak. Don't you worry about it, though. Just think about other things till you get strong. You know, he said, it isn't exactly the easiest thing in the world for a man of my age to find these grand openings you speak of. And when you've passed halfway from 50 to 60, you're apt to see some risk in giving up what you know how to do and trying something new. My, what a frown, she cried, blithely. Didn't I tell you to stop thinking about it till you get all well? She bent over him, giving him a gay little kiss on the bridge of his nose. There, I must run to breakfast. Cheer up now. Au revoir. And with her pretty hand, she waved further encouragement from the closing door as she departed. Lightsomely descending the narrow stairway, she whistled as she went, her fingers drumming time on the rail, and still whistling, she came into the dining room, where her mother and her brother were already at the table. The brother, a thin and sallow boy of 20, greeted her without much approval as she took her place. Nothing seems to be troubling you, he said. No, nothing much, she made her airy response. What's troubling yourself, Walter? Oh, don't let that worry you, he returned, seeming to consider this to be repartee of an effective sort, for he furnished a short laugh to go with it and turned to his coffee with the manner of one who has satisfactorily closed an episode. Walter always seems to have so many secrets, Alice said, studying him shrewdly, but with a friendly enough amusement in her scrutiny. Everything he does or says seems to be acted for the benefit of some mysterious audience inside himself, and he always gets its applause. Take what he said just now. He seems to think it means something, but if it does, why, that's just another secret between him and the secret audience inside of him. We don't really know anything about Walter at all, do we, Mama? Walter laughed again, in a manner that sustained her theory well enough. Then, after finishing his coffee, he took from his pocket a flattened packet in glazed blue paper, extracted with stained fingers a bent and wrinkled little cigarette, lighted it, hitched up his belt trousers with the air of a person who turns from trifles to things better worth his attention, and left the room. Alice laughed as the door closed. He's all secrets, she said. Don't you think you really ought to know more about him, Mama? I'm sure he's a good boy, Mrs. Adams returned, thoughtfully. He's been very brave about not being able to have the advantage that are enjoyed by boys he's grown up with. I've never heard a word of complaint from him. About his not being sent to college, Alice cried. I should think you wouldn't. He didn't even have enough ambition to finish high school. Mrs. Adams sighed. It seemed to me Walter lost his ambition when nearly all the boys he'd grown up with went to Eastern school to prepare for college. And we couldn't afford to send him. If only your father would have listened. Alice interrupted. What nonsense! Walter hated books and studying, and athletics, too, for that matter. He doesn't care for anything nice that I ever heard of. What do you suppose he does like, Mama? He must like something or other somewhere. But what do you suppose it is? What does he do with his time? Why, the poor boy's at Lamb's and Company all day. He doesn't get through until 5 in the afternoon. He doesn't have much time. Well, we never have dinner until about 7, and he's always late for dinner, and goes out heaven knows where right afterward. Alice shook her head. He used to go with our friends, boys, but I don't think he does now. Why, how could he? Mrs. Adams protested. That isn't his fault, poor child. The boys he knew when he was younger are nearly all away at college. Yes, but he doesn't see anything of 'em when they're here at holiday time or vacation. None of 'em come to the house anymore. I suppose he's made other friends. It's natural for him to want companions at his age. Yes, Alice said with disapproving emphasis, but who are they? I've got an idea he plays pool at some rough place downtown. Oh, no, I'm sure he's a steady boy, Mrs. Adams protested, but her tone was not that of thoroughgoing conviction. And she added, life might be a very different thing for him if only your father can be brought to see. Never mind, Mamma. It isn't me that has to be convinced, you know, and we can do a lot more with Papa if you won't say any more to him until, well, until he's able to come downstairs to table, will you? Mrs. Adams bit her lip, which had begun to tremble. I think you can trust me to know a few things, Alice, she said. I'm a little older than you, you know. That's a good girl, Alice jumped up, laughing. Don't forget, it's the same as a promise, and do just cheer him up a little. I'll say goodbye to him before I go out. Where are you going? Oh, I've got lots to do. I thought I'd run to Mildred's to see what she's going to wear tonight. And then I want to go down and buy a yard of chiffon and some narrow ribbon to make new bows for my slippers. You'll have to give me some money. If he'll give it to me, her mother lamented as they went toward the front stairs together. But an hour later, she came into Alice's room with a bill in her hand. He has some money in his bureau drawer, she said. He finally told me where it was. There were traces of emotion in her voice, and Alice, looking shrewdly at her, saw moisture in her eyes. Mamma, she cried, you didn't do what you promised to me you wouldn't do, did you? Not before Miss Perry. Miss Perry's getting him some broth, Mrs. Adams returned calmly. Besides, you're mistaken in saying I promised you anything. I said I thought you could trust me to know what is right. So you did bring it up again, and Alice swung away from her, strode to her father's door, flung it open, went to him, and put a light hand soothingly over his unrelaxed forehead. Poor old Papa, she said. It's a shame how everybody wants to trouble him. He shan't be bothered any more at all. He doesn't need to have everybody telling him how to get away from that old hole he's worked in so long, and to begin to make us all nice and rich. He knows how. Thereupon she kissed him a consoling goodbye, and made another gay departure, the charming hand again fluttering like a white butterfly in the shadow of the closing door. That's the end of chapter 2. I will see you for chapter 3, and things will get better. This is just our first episode of this book, and as I learn the language of the book and how it's laid out, it'll be easier for me to read it. But I'm not a professional. I hope you have enjoyed it, and I'll see you for chapter 3. Thank you. Have fun today.